August 17, 1987. 180 feet below the Caribbean surface, where sunlight surrenders to darkness, a team of deep-sea salvage divers made a discovery that would reopen one of the most haunting mysteries in maritime history. The wreck had been there for decades, a forgotten tomb of twisted metal and decay, its secrets buried beneath layers of coral and time. The water at that depth pressed against them with crushing weight, each breath from their regulators a reminder of how far they were from the world above. Their powerful underwater lights cut through the murky darkness, illuminating clouds of sediment that danced like ghosts in the current. Then, in a chamber that appeared to have once been a cargo hold, they saw it. An ancient trunk, its wood black with rot and marine growth, stood open as if waiting. Around it, deteriorated fabrics lay scattered across the ocean floor like funeral shrouds, barely recognizable as what they once were. A thin veil of mist seemed to hang in the water itself, particles catching the light in an almost supernatural display. And there, resting among the ruins and ruin, gleaming as if untouched by the 28 years that had passed, was a necklace. Not just any necklace. Emeralds. Colombian emeralds, each stone perfectly cut and aligned in sequence, leading to a center stone so large, so impossibly brilliant, that even at 180 feet below the surface, even through decades of ocean water, it seemed to pulse with an inner fire. The green was so vivid, it looked like bottled light, a piece of impossible beauty in a grave of decay. One of the divers reached out with a gloved hand, his movements slow in the dense water. As he lifted the necklace, the emeralds caught the beam of his light, and for a moment, the entire chamber seemed to illuminate with that otherworldly green glow. They had no idea whose necklace it was. Not yet. But when they surfaced, and photographs were compared against old records, when experts were called in and families were contacted, the truth emerged like something from a nightmare. This was the Mitchell Emerald Necklace, the one that had vanished with Ashley Mitchell on a moonlit night in March 1959. The one that had disappeared without a trace, along with the beautiful young woman who had been wearing it. Before we dive deeper into this mystery, make sure you're subscribed to this channel and hit that notification bell. What happened on PDT that cruise in 1959 involves secrets that sink deeper than the ocean floor. A truth so disturbing it stayed hidden for nearly 3 decades. And by the end, you'll understand why some mysteries refuse to be solved. The question that haunted investigators then, and continues to haunt us now, is devastatingly simple. How did Ashley Mitchell's necklace end up in a shipwreck 180 feet below the surface when she disappeared from a luxury cruise ship that never sank? What happened on that ship in 1959? And more terrifying still, where is Ashley Mitchell? To understand the magnitude of what was lost that night, you need to understand who Ashley Mitchell was. Not the headlines, not the society page photographs. The real woman behind the pearls and champagne smiles. Ashley Mitchell was 27 years old in the spring of 1959, though people who knew her said she possessed a presence that made her seem both older and younger at the same time. Older in her poise, her grace, the way she could command a room simply by entering it. Younger in her laugh, which was described by her friends as infectious and completely without pretense. The kind of laugh that made everyone around her want to laugh, too. She stood 5 feet 7 inches tall, which was considered quite tall for a woman in that era, and she carried herself with the kind of posture that suggested years of deportment classes and cotillion balls. Her hair was platinum blonde, not from a bottle, but natural. The kind of pale gold that seemed to catch light, even in dim rooms. She wore it in the style of the time, perfectly coiffed in soft waves that framed her face, though her younger sister would later tell investigators that Ashley's favorite moments were when she could let it down, when she could run her fingers through it and let it fall naturally around her shoulders. Her eyes were what people remembered most, a striking blue, the color of the Caribbean waters she would eventually disappear into, fringed with naturally dark lashes that needed no mascara. But it wasn't just the color. It was the way she looked at people. Her cousin would later say, "Ashley had this way of making you feel like you were the only person in the world when she spoke to you. She'd look right into your eyes, and you knew she was actually listening, actually caring about what you had to say." She had a small beauty mark just above the left corner of her mouth, which she never tried to hide. In an era when such marks were sometimes considered flaws, Ashley wore hers like a signature. Her smile was wide and genuine, revealing perfectly straight white teeth, and she smiled often. Perhaps too often, some would later speculate. Perhaps she smiled to hide things no one was supposed to see. Ashley was born into wealth, the kind of old money that came from Texas oil fields and shrewd investments made generations before. Her father, Robert Mitchell Sr., had expanded the family fortune into shipping and real estate. The family maintained homes in Houston, Palm Beach, and Manhattan. But Ashley herself was never ostentatious about the money. Yes, she wore designer dresses and owned jewelry that could fund small countries, but those who knew her said she was far more likely to be found in simple slacks and a cotton blouse, her feet bare, reading a book in the garden of their Palm Beach estate. She loved literature, particularly the Romantic poets, Byron, Shelley, Keats. Her bedroom, which investigators would later photograph, contained over 200 books, many of them annotated in her neat handwriting. She loved music, too, everything from classical to the new rock and roll that was scandalizing parents across America. She could play piano beautifully, though she always insisted she wasn't very good. Her mother would later tell police that some of her fondest memories were hearing Ashley play Chopin nocturnes in the evening, the music drifting through their Palm Beach home like a ghost. But perhaps what defined Ashley most was her genuine kindness. This wasn't the performative charity of the wealthy, the writing of checks to feel good about oneself. Ashley volunteered at a children's hospital in Palm Beach every Thursday afternoon, reading to kids who were too sick to go to school. She knew all their names, their favorite stories, their fears and dreams. She sent them cards on their birthdays. When one young boy needed an experimental treatment the family couldn't afford, Ashley quietly paid for it. The family only found out after the boy recovered. Her daily routine was one of comfortable privilege, but also genuine purpose. She'd wake at 7 a.m., have coffee while reading the newspaper, then spend the morning either at the hospital or working with the various charitable organizations she supported. Lunch was usually with friends at the beach club, though she preferred the smaller, quieter tables away from the main dining room. Afternoons might be spent shopping or sailing, or simply lying by the pool with a book. Evenings were for social events, charity galas, dinner parties. She was a fixture of Palm Beach society, but she never seemed to take it too seriously. And then there was Richard Mitchell. They'd met at a New Year's Eve party in 1958, just 3 months before the cruise. Richard was 31, handsome in that clean-cut, all-American way that was popular in the late 50s. He worked in his own family's banking business in Boston, though he'd been spending more time in Florida, ostensibly for business, but really, as friends later said, to pursue Ashley. The courtship was whirlwind, the kind of romance that made the society pages swoon. Flowers delivered daily, weekend trips to New York, dancing under the stars at the Breakers Hotel. Richard proposed on Valentine's Day, 1959, presenting her with a 5-carat diamond ring at Sunset on Worth Avenue. She said yes immediately, according to witnesses, throwing her arms around him with a joy that seemed almost childlike. They married on March 7, 1959, in a small ceremony at the Episcopal Church in Palm Beach, just family and close friends. Ashley wore a simple white silk gown, and, around her neck, the emerald necklace that would become both her signature and, eventually, her mystery. The necklace had been her grandmother's, a gift from Ashley's grandfather after a successful business deal in Colombia in the 1920s. 7 perfect Colombian emeralds, each one carefully selected, with a center stone that weighed nearly 15 carats. The green was so pure, so vivid, that gemologists who'd seen it said it was one of the finest examples they'd ever encountered. Ashley wore it on her wedding day as something old, and she would wear it 8 days later on the cruise ship, the last night anyone would see her alive. The honeymoon cruise was Richard's idea. 2 weeks sailing the Caribbean on the Caribbean Star, one of the most luxurious cruise ships of the era. Private suites, world-class dining, entertainment every evening. A chance for them to start their new life together, away from the pressures and expectations of their families and social circles. Ashley had been excited, her friends said. She'd spent weeks planning her wardrobe, buying new swimsuits and evening gowns, daydreaming about the islands they would visit. On March 12, 1959, Ashley and Richard Mitchell boarded the Caribbean Star in Miami, waving goodbye to family members who'd come to see them off. Ashley was wearing a yellow sundress and white gloves, her blonde hair catching the Florida sunshine, that emerald necklace glinting at her throat. She was smiling, that brilliant smile that everyone remembered. She looked like a woman who had everything to live for. 3 days later, she would be gone, vanished into the night like a ghost, leaving behind only questions and, eventually, a necklace glowing green in the darkness of a sunken ship, 180 feet below the surface of the sea. March 15, 1959 began like any other day on the Caribbean Star. The ship had departed Miami 3 days earlier, making its way through the crystalline waters of the Caribbean, with 847 passengers and 312 crew members aboard. The weather that morning was perfect, the kind of day that cruise brochures promised but rarely delivered. Temperatures in the low 80s, gentle breeze, not a cloud in the brilliant blue sky. Ashley and Richard Mitchell had breakfast in their suite around 8:30 a.m. Room service records show they ordered fresh fruit, scrambled eggs, toast, coffee for Richard, and tea for Ashley. The steward who delivered the meal would later tell investigators that the couple seemed happy, relaxed. Ashley was wearing a light blue robe, her hair down around her shoulders. Richard answered the door in slacks and a white undershirt. They thanked him, tipped generously, and the steward left them alone. They spent the morning on the pool deck. Several passengers would later remember seeing them, Ashley in a red one-piece swimsuit that showed off her slender figure, Richard in navy swim trunks. They swam, they sunbathed, they read magazines side by side on white lounge chairs. A photographer who was capturing candid shots of passengers for the ship's daily bulletin took several pictures of them. In those photographs, Ashley is smiling, her wet hair slicked back from her face, her hand resting on Richard's arm. They look like what they were supposed to be, newlyweds in paradise. Lunch was at the Starlight Cafe at 12:45 p.m. They sat with another couple they'd befriended on the cruise, Thomas and Dorothy Hayes from Atlanta. The four of them shared a table near the windows, overlooking the endless blue of the Caribbean. The conversation was light, Dorothy would later recall. They talked about the islands they would visit, about plans for when they returned home, about mundane, happy things. Ashley ordered the chef's salad and iced tea. She ate most of her meal. She seemed perfectly normal, perfectly content. The afternoon was spent in their suite. The weather had turned slightly warm, and they wanted to rest before the evening's festivities. The ship was hosting a formal captain's gala that night, one of the highlights of any Caribbean Star cruise. Passengers were expected to dress in their finest. For Ashley, that meant one very specific piece of jewelry. At 6 p.m., Richard left the suite to get ice from the machine down the corridor. When he returned 3 minutes later, Ashley was in the bathroom, already starting to prepare for the evening. He could hear the shower running, could see steam escaping from under the door. He mixed himself a bourbon and water, sat on the edge of the bed, and waited. Ashley emerged at 6:35 p.m. in a white terry cloth robe, her hair wrapped in a towel. She sat at the vanity and began the careful process of applying makeup, styling her hair. Richard showered and dressed in his tuxedo. By 7:15 p.m., they were both nearly ready. And then Ashley opened the suite's safe and removed the emerald necklace. She'd worn it twice before on the cruise, but tonight, she told Richard, she wanted to wear something special. The gala was formal, elegant, and the necklace deserved to be seen. She fastened it around her neck, the green stones catching the light from the vanity bulbs, and she turned to show Richard. He would later tell investigators that she looked more beautiful than he'd ever seen her, that the emeralds seemed to make her blue eyes even more striking. At 7:30 p.m., Ashley and Richard Mitchell left their suite and made their way to the grand ballroom. She was wearing a floor-length black velvet gown with a sweetheart neckline that perfectly displayed the emerald necklace. Her hair was styled in an elegant updo, showing off the graceful line of her neck. She wore long white gloves that reached past her elbows. She looked, according to multiple witnesses, like something from a Hollywood movie. The captain's gala was everything it promised to be. The grand ballroom had been decorated with white roses and gold ribbons. A live orchestra played big band music. Champagne flowed freely. The captain himself, Malcolm Hendricks, welcomed the passengers and gave a short speech about the proud tradition of the Caribbean Star. Ashley and Richard sat at a table with the Hayes couple and two other pairs they'd met during the cruise. Dinner was served at 8 p.m. Lobster thermidor, filet mignon, roasted vegetables, and a chocolate soufflé for dessert. Multiple witnesses would later confirm that Ashley seemed to be enjoying herself immensely. She danced with Richard 3 times. She laughed at jokes. She complimented Dorothy Hayes on her dress. She ate her dinner, though not all of it, leaving most of the filet mignon untouched. She drank 2 glasses of champagne over the course of the evening. She showed no signs of distress, no indication that anything was wrong. At 10:15 p.m., Ashley excused herself to use the powder room. She returned 7 minutes later, reapplying lipstick as she walked. At 10:45 p.m., she and Richard danced to Moonlight Serenade, her head resting on his shoulder, the emerald necklace gleaming under the Iggy ballroom lights. At 11:20 p.m., she told Richard she was feeling slightly tired and wanted some fresh air. He offered to accompany her, but she smiled and said she'd just be a few minutes, that she wanted to walk alone and clear her head. He kissed her cheek and let her go. Security footage would later show Ashley Mitchell leaving the Grand Ballroom at exactly 11:22 p.m. She walked through the main corridor, nodding to a steward who passed her going the opposite direction. She took the stairs to the observation deck, emerging into the warm Caribbean night at 11:24 p.m. The observation deck was a popular spot during the day, but at night it was usually deserted. Located at the rear of the ship, it offered unobstructed views of the wake and the stars. There were no security cameras on the deck itself, a detail that would prove catastrophically important later. The only light came from a few dim fixtures along the railings and the glow of the moon, which was nearly full that night. At 11:45 p.m., a crew member named James Foster, a 28-year-old assistant engineer, went to the observation deck to smoke a cigarette during his break. He would later testify that he saw a woman standing alone at the far railing, looking out at the water. She was wearing a dark dress and had blonde hair. He couldn't see her face clearly, but the description matched Ashley Mitchell perfectly. He smoked his cigarette, stubbed it out in an ashtray, and returned to his duties at 11:52 p.m. The woman was still standing at the railing when he left. That was the last confirmed sighting of Ashley Mitchell. Richard waited in the Grand Ballroom until midnight, then began to worry. Ashley had been gone for 40 minutes, longer than she'd intended. He went looking for her, checking the powder room first, then walking through the main corridors, asking crew members if they'd seen a woman in a black velvet dress with an emerald necklace. No, one had, not recently. Growing more concerned, he went to their suite, thinking perhaps she'd returned there and fallen asleep. The suite was empty. Her black velvet evening bag was on the bed, but Ashley was nowhere to be found. At 12:25 a.m., Richard Mitchell reported his wife missing to the ship's security. By 12:40 a.m., a full search of the Caribbean Star was underway. The conditions that night were nearly perfect for visibility. The sea was calm, with swells of only 2 to 3 feet. The moon was bright enough to read by. The ship's powerful searchlights swept the water in every direction, looking for any sign of a person overboard. Every deck was searched, every public room, every storage area, every inch of the ship where a person could possibly be. Ashley's name was called over the ship's intercom repeatedly. Crew members knocked on every cabin door, asking if anyone had seen her. By 3 a.m., it was clear that Ashley Mitchell was not on the Caribbean Star. She had, somehow, impossibly, vanished. At 3:15 a.m. on March 16, 1959, Captain Malcolm Hendricks made the decision that would define the rest of his career. He ordered the Caribbean Star to stop, to hold position in the middle of the Caribbean Sea, and he radioed the United States Coast Guard. A passenger was missing, presumed overboard. They needed help immediately. The Coast Guard responded with impressive speed. By 4:30 a.m., 2 helicopters and 3 patrol boats were en route to the Caribbean Star's coordinates. By sunrise, at 6:42 a.m., a full maritime search and rescue operation was underway. Boats circled in an expanding spiral pattern from the ship's last known position. Helicopters flew low over the water, their crews scanning for any sign of a person. The search radius was calculated based on current, wind speed, and the time Ashley had been missing. It covered approximately 150 square miles of ocean. They found nothing, no body, no debris, no sign that Ashley Mitchell had ever entered the water. On board the Caribbean Star, chaos reigned. Passengers who'd been sleeping were woken by the commotion, by the searchlights and the sound of helicopters overhead. Word spread quickly. The beautiful blonde woman with the emerald necklace had vanished during the night. Some passengers packed their bags, demanding to be taken back to Miami immediately. Others gathered in small groups, whispering theories, each one more outlandish than the last. Richard Mitchell was questioned extensively by both ship security and, once they arrived by helicopter, FBI agents who specialized in maritime incidents. The questioning took place in the captain's private office. Richard was devastated, barely able to speak coherently. He kept saying, "I should have gone with her. I should have walked her to the deck. This is my fault." The agents noted that his distress seemed genuine, that there were no signs of deception in his body, language, or his answers. His hands shook. His eyes were red from crying. He'd loved his wife, that much was clear, but they had to ask the difficult questions anyway. Had they been fighting? No, never, Richard insisted. They'd been happy, truly happy. Had Ashley seemed depressed? Suicidal? Absolutely not. She'd been excited about their future together, about starting a family when they returned home. Had there been any threats against her? Anyone who might want to harm her? Richard couldn't think of anyone. Ashley was loved by everyone who knew her. She had no enemies. The agents searched their suite with Richard's permission. They found Ashley's personal effects exactly as she'd left them. Her black velvet evening bag containing lipstick, a compact, and a small amount of cash. Her suitcases, half unpacked, filled with clothes and shoes. Her toiletries neatly arranged in the bathroom. What they didn't find was the emerald necklace. It should have been in the suite safe if Ashley had returned there, but the safe was empty, except for Richard's watch and wallet. The necklace was gone, just like Ashley. Over the next 48 hours, as the Coast Guard continued their increasingly futile search, FBI agents interviewed all 847 passengers and 312 crew members aboard the Caribbean Star. It was an unprecedented undertaking, requiring teams of agents to be helicoptered to the ship in shifts. They set up an interview room in one of the Chu ship's conference halls and worked around the clock. The interviews revealed a picture of Ashley Mitchell's last evening that was both clear and frustratingly incomplete. Multiple witnesses confirmed seeing her at dinner, on the dance floor, leaving the ballroom at 11:22 p.m. James Foster, the engineer, confirmed seeing a woman matching her description on the observation deck at 11:45 p.m. But after that, nothing. It was as if she'd simply ceased to exist. Several passengers came forward with information that initially seemed promising, but ultimately led nowhere. An elderly woman claimed to have heard a scream around midnight, but she couldn't say where it had come from, and no one else reported hearing anything unusual. A man said he'd seen two figures struggling near the railing of the observation deck, but when pressed for details, he admitted his eyesight was poor and he couldn't be certain what he'd actually seen. A teenager swore she'd seen Ashley in the corridor near the suites at 1 a.m., but the timeline made that impossible, and the girl eventually admitted she might have been mistaken. The ship's crew came under particular scrutiny. In 1959, maritime law enforcement was not as sophisticated as it would later become, but the FBI agents were thorough. They checked every crew member's background, looking for criminal records, suspicious behavior, any reason someone might have harmed Ashley Mitchell. They found nothing significant. A few crew members had minor offenses in their past, nothing violent, nothing that suggested they were capable of murder or kidnapping. The theory that began to take hold, simply because no other explanation fit the facts, was that Ashley had accidentally fallen overboard. Perhaps she'd been standing at the railing, leaning out to look at the water, and she'd lost her balance. The railing on the observation deck was 42 inches high, tall enough to be safe under normal circumstances, but not impossible to topple over if someone leaned too far. It was the only explanation that made sense, even though it raised its own terrible questions. Why hadn't she screamed? Why hadn't anyone heard a splash? And why, if she'd fallen into calm seas under a bright moon, hadn't the Coast Guard found her body? Ashley's family arrived in Miami on March 17th, having been flown in from Texas on a private plane. Her mother, Catherine Mitchell, was barely functional with grief. Her father, Robert Sr., was stoic but clearly shattered. Her younger sister, Caroline, just 22 years old, couldn't stop crying. They held a press conference at the urging of the FBI, hoping that publicity might generate new leads. The photographs from that press conference are heartbreaking. Catherine Mitchell, wearing dark glasses to hide her tears, clutching a photo of Ashley from the wedding. Robert Sr., his jaw clenched, his hands gripping the podium. Caroline, her face, a mask of anguish. "If anyone knows anything," Catherine Mitchell said, her voice breaking, "if anyone saw anything, please, please come forward. Ashley is our daughter, our sister, our friend. She doesn't deserve this. We need to bring her home." But no one came forward with information that changed anything. The Coast Guard search was officially called off on March 20th, 5 days after Ashley's disappearance. The statistical probability of finding a survivor after that much time, especially with no evidence of where she'd entered the water, was essentially zero. The Caribbean Star was released to continue its voyage, though the cruise was effectively ruined. Most passengers disembarked in Miami as soon as the ship docked on March 22nd, wanting nothing more than to be on solid ground again. The FBI investigation continued for another 6 weeks, but without new evidence, there was nowhere for it to go. On May 2nd, 1959, the case was officially classified as death by misadventure, presumed accidental drowning. There was no body to bury, no closure for the family, just an empty coffin at a memorial service in Palm Beach, attended by over 400 people, all of them mourning a woman who'd simply vanished into the night. Richard Mitchell never fully recovered. He returned to Boston but couldn't focus on work. Friends said he aged 10 years in a matter of months. He never removed his wedding ring. He kept Ashley's photograph on his desk, another in his wallet, another on his bedside table. He funded a scholarship in her name at the Children's Hospital where she'd volunteered. He never dated, never remarried. When people asked him why, he'd say simply, "I'm still married. My wife is just missing." The Mitchell family hired private investigators, offered rewards totaling $50,000 for information, placed ads in newspapers across the country. Nothing came of it. Ashley Mitchell had disappeared as completely as if she'd never existed, leaving behind only memories, grief, and one final haunting question. What had really happened on that observation deck on the night of March 15th, 1959? The answer to that question would remain hidden for 28 years, buried in the darkness of the Caribbean Sea, waiting in a shipwreck 180 feet below the surface, guarded by an emerald necklace that refused to stop shining. The years following Ashley Mitchell's disappearance were marked by a peculiar kind of limbo, a suspended grief that never quite resolved because there was never quite proof that she was dead. For the Mitchell family, time didn't heal. It just stretched the wound wider. Catherine Mitchell, Ashley's mother, became obsessed with the case in a way that worried her family and friends. She kept Ashley's room in their Palm Beach home exactly as it had been the day Ashley left for her honeymoon. The books on the shelves, the clothes in the closet, the photographs on the dresser, all preserved like a shrine. She spent hours in that room, sitting on Ashley's bed, reading Ashley's annotated poetry books, trying to understand something that had no understanding. Every year on March 15th, Catherine would place an ad in the Miami Herald. "Ashley, if you're out there, Please come home. We love you. We're waiting. Mom. It was irrational. Everyone knew that. If Ashley were alive, if she'd somehow survived or run away, she would have contacted them. But grief is not rational, and hope dies harder than we like to admit. Robert Mitchell Sr. took a different approach. He turned his grief into action, channeling his pain into a crusade for improved maritime safety. He lobbied Congress for stricter regulations on cruise ships, for better monitoring systems, for mandatory security cameras on all observation decks. Some of his proposals were adopted. Others weren't. It didn't matter to him. He needed to feel like he was doing something, needed to believe that his daughter's death could prevent other deaths. Caroline, Ashley's younger sister, perhaps suffered the most in her own way. She'd been 22 when Ashley disappeared, on the cusp of her own adult life, planning her own wedding. After Ashley vanished, Caroline called off the engagement. She couldn't bear the thought of happiness when her sister might be at the bottom of the ocean. She moved back home to Palm Beach, helping her mother cope, watching her father wage his legislative battles, trying to hold a family together that was missing its brightest piece. Richard Mitchell's story took a darker turn. He tried to return to normal life, tried to work at the bank, tried to exist in a world where his wife had simply evaporated. But the whispers followed him everywhere. People wondered, as people always do. Had he killed her? Had there been a fight on that observation deck? Had he pushed her over the railing and then played the grieving husband? The FBI had cleared him, yes, but the court of public opinion is not bound by evidence. By 1962, 3 years after Ashley's disappearance, Richard had left Boston. He couldn't stand the looks anymore, the whispered conversations that stopped when he entered a room, the way old friends avoided him at social events. He moved to California, to a small town north of San Francisco where nobody knew his story. He got a job at a local bank under his middle name. He lived alone in a rented cottage, overlooking the Pacific Ocean. People who knew him there said he'd walk the beach for hours every evening, staring out at the water as if it might finally give him an answer. Meanwhile, the story of Ashley Mitchell's disappearance had taken on a life of its own. In 1961, a pulp magazine published a sensationalized account titled "The Socialite Who Vanished at Sea: What Really Happened." It was full of speculation and invented details, suggesting everything from a love triangle gone wrong to a mafia hit disguised as an accident. The Mitchell family sued for libel and won a small settlement, but the damage was done. The case had become tabloid fodder. In 1965, a woman in San Diego contacted police claiming to be Ashley Mitchell, saying she'd survived but had amnesia and was only now remembering her identity. The woman looked nothing like Ashley, had a completely different background that was easily verified, and appeared to be suffering from delusional disorder. She was hospitalized for psychiatric treatment, but the incident renewed media interest in the case, and for several weeks, the Mitchell family endured another round of painful publicity. There were other false sightings over the years. A blonde woman spotted in Mexico City in 1967 who resembled Ashley. A woman matching her description allegedly seen boarding a ferry in Greece in 1970. Each time, the Mitchell family's hopes would rise and then crash. Each time, the investigation led nowhere. It was torture, this endless cycle of maybe, this refusal of the universe to provide certainty. The maritime community, particularly those who worked on cruise ships, developed their own theories about what had happened. Some crew members who'd been on the Caribbean Star that night later came forward with suspicions they hadn't voiced during the initial investigation. One steward suggested that Ashley might have been drunk, more drunk than the 2 glasses of champagne suggested, and had fallen over the railing in an impaired state. But toxicology reports couldn't be run without a body, so this remained pure speculation. Others in the maritime world whispered about more sinister possibilities. There were rumors, never substantiated, of a crew member who'd been fired shortly after the incident, who'd left the country, who might have had something to do with Ashley's disappearance. The FBI followed up on these leads, tracked the man down in Venezuela, in 1968, interviewed him extensively. He had an alibi for the night Ashley disappeared, confirmed by multiple witnesses. Another dead end. By the 1970s, the case had gone cold in the official sense, filed away in archives, mentioned only occasionally in true crime books or magazine retrospectives. The Mitchell family's private investigators had given up. The FBI had moved on to other cases. The Caribbean Star had been sold, renamed, and eventually scrapped in 1973. The observation deck where Ashley was last seen was cut apart and melted down, becoming something else entirely, carrying no memory of that March night in 1959. But Ashley Mitchell wasn't forgotten. How could she be? A beautiful young woman vanishing on her honeymoon, wearing a fortune in emeralds, leaving behind no trace. It was the kind of story that lodges in the collective imagination, that gets passed down, that refuses to be filed away completely. Cold case enthusiasts studied it. True crime forums debated it. Amateur sleuths tried to solve it. The prevailing theory, the one that most investigators and researchers eventually settled on, was the simplest. Ashley had leaned too far over the railing, had lost her balance, and had fallen into the Caribbean Sea. The necklace had fallen with her, or had been removed by the current as her body sank. The body itself had been consumed by the ocean, by sharks, or decomposition, or simply the vast emptiness of the sea. It was a tragedy, a terrible accident, but not a mystery. Just bad luck and worse timing. This theory satisfied most people. It was neat, it was probable, and it required no villains beyond circumstance and gravity. The Mitchell family, after years of fighting against it, eventually accepted this version of events. In 1980, 21 years after Ashley's disappearance, they held a second memorial service, a final goodbye. They'd finally, painfully, learned to live with not knowing. And then, 7 years later, on a bright August morning in 1987, divers found the necklace. The salvage operation that led to the discovery of Ashley Mitchell's emerald necklace was purely coincidental, a twist of fate that seemed almost scripted. The team of divers, led by a marine salvage expert named Marcus Webb, had been hired by a private collector to investigate a shipwreck that had been located by sonar 6 months earlier. Initial identification suggested it was a small passenger vessel that had gone down sometime in the early 1960s, though records were unclear about its exact identity or the circumstances of its sinking. The wreck lay at 180 feet below the surface, right at the edge of recreational diving depth, in waters approximately 40 miles off the coast of the Bahamas. Marcus Webb and his team of 4 divers began their descent on the morning of August 17, 1987. The water was surprisingly clear for that depth, visibility extending maybe 30 feet in the beam of their underwater lights. The wreck itself was exactly where the sonar had indicated, lying on its side on a sandy bottom, encrusted with coral and marine growth. The divers spent their first hour surveying the exterior of the wreck, taking photographs, making notes. The vessel was about 120 feet long, a modest-sized ship that had clearly taken significant damage when it sank. The hull was breached in several places, offering entry points to the interior. On their second dive of the day, Around 2 p.m., Marcus Webb and another diver, Peter Chen, entered through one of these breaches to explore what appeared to have once been a passenger cabin area. It was dark inside the wreck, the kind of darkness that exists only in the deep ocean, absolute and disorienting. Their lights cut through it, illuminating clouds of sediment disturbed by their presence, small fish that darted away from the beams, the twisted remains of the ship's interior structure. They moved slowly, carefully, aware that wrecks at this depth could be unstable, that disturbing the wrong beam could bring sections collapsing down. That's when Peter Chen saw the trunk. It was wedged against what had once been a bulkhead, an old-fashioned wooden trunk, the kind you might have seen in an attic or antique shop. The wood was black with age and marine growth, but the trunk's basic shape was still intact. More unusually, it was open, its lid tilted back as if someone had been interrupted while going through its contents. Peter signaled to Marcus, and together they swam closer. Around the trunk, scattered across the deck of the hold, were the remains of fabrics, so deteriorated they were barely recognizable as cloth anymore. There was something else, too, a strange quality to the water immediately around the trunk. Particles suspended in the liquid, catching their lights in a way that created an almost ethereal effect, like mist or smoke frozen in time. And then Marcus Webb saw the necklace. It lay half buried in the sediment just in front of the trunk, and even through 28 years of ocean water, even at 180 feet deep, where colors are muted by the pressure and the darkness, the emeralds seemed to glow. Marcus would later tell reporters that his first thought was that his eyes were playing tricks on him, that no stone could look that vivid at that depth. But as he moved closer, as his light beam hit the necklace directly, there was no denying it. 7 emeralds, perfectly cut and aligned, with a center stone that seemed to capture and amplify the light from his underwater torch. He reached out carefully, his gloved hand moving through the water with the slow-motion quality that all movement has at depth, and lifted the necklace. It was heavy, heavier than he expected, the gold chain intact despite the decades underwater. He held it up, and Peter Chen swam closer to look. For a long moment, neither diver moved. They just stared at this impossible piece of beauty in the wreck of a ship that had nothing to do with jewelry or treasure. Their dive time was running short, nitrogen building up in their blood, and they needed to begin their ascent. Marcus carefully placed the necklace in a mesh collection bag attached to his belt, and the 2 divers made their way out of the wreck and back toward the surface, stopping at predetermined depths for decompression, letting their bodies adjust to the pressure changes. When they finally surfaced and climbed aboard their support vessel, when Marcus opened the mesh bag and lifted out the necklace in the bright Caribbean sunshine, the entire crew gathered around. Even in daylight, even covered in a thin film of sediment, the emeralds were stunning. The center stone, in particular, seemed to capture light in a way that natural stones shouldn't be able to. It was, one crew member said, like holding a piece of bottled starlight. But what was a necklace like this doing in this unidentified wreck? That ship appeared to have been carrying passengers, not cargo, but the trunk and fabrics didn't match what would be expected. More puzzling, the trunk looked older, and the fabrics, what little remained of them, suggested styles from an earlier decade. Back in port that evening, Marcus Webb took the necklace to a jewelry appraiser he knew in Nassau, a man named Harold Stevens, who specialized in estate jewelry and historical pieces. Harold examined the necklace under magnification, tested the metal, studied the emeralds with a practiced eye. What he told Marcus made the salvage diver's blood run cold. These were Colombian emeralds, Harold said. Exceptional quality, likely from the Muzo mine, based on their color and clarity. The cut and setting style dated to the 1920s or early 1930s. The necklace was worth, at minimum, $500,000, possibly more, depending on provenance. But more importantly, Harold had seen photographs of this necklace before. He was certain of it. He asked Marcus to give him a day to check his reference materials. The next morning, Harold Stevens called Marcus Webb with information that seemed impossible. He'd found it in a book about famous missing jewelry, a chapter on pieces lost to mysterious circumstances. The Mitchell Emerald Necklace, last seen worn by socialite Ashley Mitchell when she vanished from a cruise ship on March 15, 1959. The description matched perfectly. The 7 stones, the distinctive large center emerald, the gold chain with its particular clasp design. Marcus Webb immediately contacted the FBI. By that afternoon, agents were on their way to Nassau. They brought with them original photographs of Ashley Mitchell wearing the necklace at her wedding and at the captain's gala the night she disappeared. They compared these to the necklace Marcus had recovered. There was no doubt. This was Ashley's necklace. But how had it ended up in a shipwreck that went down after she disappeared? The FBI investigation that reopened in August 1987 was more sophisticated than the one in 1959. They had better forensic tools, better databases, better understanding of maritime incidents. They began by thoroughly investigating the shipwreck itself. Maritime records were searched for any vessel matching the wreck's description that had gone missing in the Caribbean between 1959 and the mid-1960s. What they discovered was both illuminating and frustrating. The wreck appeared to be that of a small private yacht or charter vessel, approximately 120 feet in length, that had likely sunk sometime in the late 1950s or early 1960s based on the construction style and materials. However, without clear identifying markers and given the deterioration of the vessel, a definitive identification proved impossible. Dozens of small vessels had gone missing in Caribbean waters during that period, many never officially reported or documented. The trunk and its contents provided more clues. Forensic analysis of the deteriorated fabrics confirmed they were luxury materials consistent with the late 1950s, the kind of expensive luggage items a wealthy traveler would have owned. The trunk itself, despite its condition, showed craftsmanship typical of high-end luggage. From that era, the FBI theorized several possibilities. The most probable scenario was that Ashley had indeed gone overboard from the Caribbean Star on March 15, 1959. Her body, along with personal effects, including the trunk and necklace, may have been recovered by crew members of another vessel in the area, possibly this smaller yacht or charter boat. For reasons that remain unclear, perhaps involving the valuable necklace itself, the discovery was never reported to authorities. That vessel then continued its journey, but encountered its own tragedy sometime in the following months or years, sinking and taking its secrets to the ocean floor. The Caribbean in the late 1950s and early 1960s saw numerous small vessel losses during hurricane season, many of which were never fully investigated or even reported if there were no survivors. This theory, while impossible to prove conclusively, explained several key elements. How Ashley's T-50 necklace ended up in a wreck, why it was found with luggage-style items from her era, and why her body was never recovered by the Coast Guard search. It had already been taken aboard another vessel by the time searchers arrived in the area. The Mitchell family was contacted, of course. Richard Mitchell, now 59 years old and living in California, was informed that his wife's necklace had been found. He flew to Washington, D.C. to meet with FBI agents to identify the necklace personally. When it was placed on a table in front of him, when he saw those emeralds again after 28 years, he broke down completely. He touched the necklace with trembling fingers, and he wept. "It's hers," he managed to say. "It's Ashley's. I'd recognize it anywhere." But when agents asked him if the discovery gave him any closure, if it answered any questions, he shook his head. "It just makes it worse," he said quietly, "because now I know she's really gone. And I still don't know what happened to her." Catherine Mitchell had passed away in 1984, 3 years before the necklace was found, never knowing what became of her daughter. Robert Mitchell Sr., now 78 and suffering from advanced heart disease, was told about the discovery but was too ill to travel. He died 6 weeks later, in October 1987. Friends said he'd held on just long enough to know that some piece of Ashley had been found, even if it wasn't the piece that mattered most. Caroline Mitchell, Ashley's sister, now 50 years old, spoke to reporters after the necklace was recovered. She stood in the garden of the family's Palm Beach home, the same garden where Ashley used to read poetry, and she tried to put into words what the discovery meant. "We always hoped," Caroline said, her voice steady despite the tears on her cheeks. "For 28 years, we hoped that maybe she was alive somewhere, that maybe she'd lost her memory, that maybe someday she'd come home. Finding the necklace ends that hope. We know now that she died that night, or very soon after. We know she's not coming home. And in a strange way, there's relief in that. Not peace. We'll never have peace. But relief. The not knowing was destroying us. At least now we know something." The emerald necklace was eventually returned to the Mitchell family as part of Ashley's estate. Richard Mitchell donated it to a maritime museum in Miami, with the condition that it be displayed alongside Ashley's story, that her memory be preserved, that people remember not just the mystery, but the woman herself. The necklace remains on display there to this day, the emeralds still gleaming after all these years, still catching light like they did on that ballroom floor in 1959, still holding their secrets close. The trunk from the shipwreck was also recovered and analyzed. It revealed nothing more of use, just rotted wood, corroded metal fittings, and the ghosts of fabrics that had long since surrendered to the sea. Whatever story it might have told had been erased by time and salt water. So, what really happened to Ashley Mitchell? After 28 years of mystery, and then the stunning discovery of her necklace in a shipwreck, do we finally have answers? The truth is both yes and no. What we know for certain is limited but significant. Ashley Mitchell disappeared from the Caribbean Star on the night of March 15, 1959. She was last seen on the EA observation deck at 11:45 p.m. By 12:25 a.m., she was gone. Her emerald necklace, the one she was wearing that night, ended up in a shipwreck at 180 feet below the Caribbean surface, discovered 28 years later in August 1987. These are facts, documented and verified. Everything else is theory, but some theories are more plausible than others. The FBI's final assessment, issued in 1988 after reviewing all available evidence, including the necklace discovery, concluded that Ashley most likely went overboard from the Caribbean Star on the night of March 15, 1959. Whether she fell accidentally, took her own life, or was pushed by someone remains unknown. The most probable explanation for the necklace's location involves a secondary vessel. Ashley's body and personal effects were likely recovered from the water by crew members of a small yacht or charter boat that was in the area shortly after she disappeared. This would explain why the Coast Guard search found nothing. The body and evidence had already been removed from the search zone by the time rescue operations began. Why wouldn't someone report finding a body? The necklace itself provides a compelling motive. In 1959, it was worth approximately $200,000, equivalent to nearly $2 million today. If a ship's crew recovered Ashley's body, along with that necklace and her personal trunk, the temptation to keep quiet and pocket the jewelry might have been overwhelming. They may have taken the valuables, disposed of the body at sea, and continued on their way. That vessel then met its own fate, sinking in the following months or years, possibly during a Caribbean storm. Small boat losses were common in that era, and often went unreported if there were no survivors or if the vessel was privately owned. The wreck lay undiscovered for decades until Marcus Webb's team found it in 1987. But this leaves questions unanswered. How did Ashley go over the railing in the first place? Did she fall? Was she pushed? The calm seas and good visibility that night make a simple accident seem less likely, though not impossible. Some investigators privately believed that Ashley might have been the victim of foul play, possibly by someone who wanted the necklace, possibly by someone with a grudge or obsession no one knew about. But without a body, without evidence, without witnesses, these suspicions remained just that. Suspicions. Richard Mitchell maintained until his death in 2003, at age 75, that Ashley would never have leaned dangerously over a railing, would never have taken risks that might result in her falling. He believed, though he could never prove it, that someone had pushed her, that her death was murder, not accident. He spent the last years of his life trying to convince authorities to reopen the case as a homicide investigation. They declined. Without new evidence, there was nowhere for such an investigation to go. The case of Ashley Mitchell remains officially classified as an unsolved death, with the circumstances uncertain. The FBI file is closed, but not resolved. Maritime law enforcement considers it a probable accident with unknown contributing factors. The truth, whatever it may be, lies 180 feet below the Caribbean surface, in waters that have long since erased all traces of that March night in 1959. What we're left with is a story that exemplifies the ocean's greatest mystery, its ability to take without explanation, to hide without revealing, to keep secrets that even time and technology cannot fully uncover. Ashley Mitchell was a real person, not a character in a thriller. She had dreams and fears, family who loved her, a future stolen in an instant. Whether she fell, whether she was pushed, whether something else entirely happened that we haven't even considered, we may never know. The emerald necklace sits in its museum case in Miami, a beautiful artifact of a beautiful life cut short. People visit it, drawn by the mystery, by the romance of the story, by the sheer impossibility of it all. They stare at those green stones and wonder, as we all wonder, what really happened on that observation deck on a moonlit night in 1959. The necklace holds the answer, perhaps, but emeralds, like the ocean, keep their secrets well. Ashley Mitchell's story refuses to fade with time. It persists, as all great mysteries do, challenging us to solve the unsolvable, to understand the incomprehensible, to find meaning in the void. Maybe that's what remains. Maybe the mystery itself is the legacy. Maybe some questions aren't meant to be answered, only asked, again and again, keeping alive the memory of a woman who deserves to be remembered. Rest in peace, Ashley Mitchell, wherever you are.